For 10 years, my family excluded me from every reunion, every holiday, every birthday party, because I was just a common laborer who embarrassed them. While my golden boy brother Jake got promoted at his corporate job, I was disinvited from his wedding because I might bring down the tone with my work clothes and calloused hands. They called me the family failure. Mom would tell people I was still trying to figure things out, while Jake got standing ovations for his quarterly reports. When I'd show up to family dinners, they'd seat me at the kids' table and make jokes about me playing with tools instead of getting a real job like Jake's. The last family reunion I wasn't invited to was Patricia's 80th birthday. Jake posted pictures all over social media of the whole family, laughing and celebrating at some fancy country club with captions about surrounding yourself with successful people. Not one person asked where I was, but now they were all standing in the circular driveway of my 3-story mansion, staring up at the marble columns and 5-car garage, their beat-up Honda Civic looking pathetic next to my Mercedes. Jake's corporate career had collapsed. Patricia needed $200,000 for heart surgery, and suddenly, they remembered I existed. Derek, honey, we know we haven't talked much lately, but family helps family, Mom said, putting on that fake smile she used when she wanted something. They had no idea what I'd discovered about family loyalty. To understand how we got to this point, you need to know how our family worked. From the moment Jake graduated college with his MBA and landed his first corporate job, he became the golden standard against which everything else was measured. Dad would brag to anyone who'd listen about his son, the business analyst who wore suits to work and gave presentations to important clients. Jake's success was the family's success. When he got promoted, they'd celebrate with expensive dinners and champagne toasts. When he bought his first house, they helped with the down payment and threw a housewarming party for 50 people. When he got engaged to his college girlfriend, Sarah, Mom spent months planning their wedding like it was a royal event. Meanwhile, I was getting my hands dirty in construction work, learning trades from guys who'd been building things since before I was born. But to my family, manual labor wasn't real work. It was what you did when you couldn't do anything else. Jake was the golden boy from day one. The way they talked about my career made it clear where I stood in the family hierarchy. Dad would introduce Jake as my son who works in corporate development, while I was Derek who's figuring things out. Mom would tell her friends that Jake was following in his father's footsteps in the business world, while I was just playing with tools and doing work that anyone could learn. The dismissal was constant and systematic. Family photos were carefully arranged so that Jake's accomplishments were visible in the background. His diploma, his employee awards, pictures from company events. My work clothes, my toolbox. Any evidence of what I actually did for a living was either hidden or treated like something embarrassing that needed to be downplayed. When relatives asked about my job, Mom would quickly change the subject to Jake's latest promotion or his upcoming business trip to some important city. The message was clear: one son was worth talking about, and the other was a disappointment who didn't fit the image they wanted to project. They called me the family failure. The exclusion pattern started small, but became more obvious over the years. First, I wasn't invited to adults-only family dinners because they were discussing serious business matters. Then I wasn't included in weekend trips because they were networking opportunities where I wouldn't fit in. Eventually, I wasn't invited to holidays because my presence made other family members uncomfortable about their own success. Jake's wedding was the final proof of where I stood. When I asked Mom about my invitation, she explained that they were keeping the guest list professional and that my blue-collar friends wouldn't enjoy the country club atmosphere. The wedding photos show a happy, successful family, with one son conspicuously absent. For 10 years, I didn't exist to them. The final breaking point came when Patricia was turning 80. I'd been hoping that maybe this milestone birthday would be different, that maybe they'd finally include me in something important. Patricia had always been the matriarch of the family, and her birthday celebrations were traditionally big family affairs, with everyone gathering to honor her. 2 weeks before the party, I called Mom to ask about the details. What time, what to bring, whether I could help with setup. The conversation that followed made it crystal clear where I stood. "Oh, Derek, honey, this year's party is going to be a little different," Mom said, in that careful tone she used when she was about to deliver bad news. "We're having it at the country club, and it's more of a networking event for Patricia's friends from the charity board. You know, people from different social circles." Different social circles. That was their polite way of saying my work boots and calloused hands wouldn't fit in with their crowd of retired executives and their wives. Jake would be there, of course, along with his MBA and his business stories. But the grandson who built houses for a living? That would be embarrassing. When I saw the photos on social media later, Patricia surrounded by her successful family. Everyone in expensive suits and designer dresses, champagne glasses raised in celebration. I realized something important. This wasn't about one party or one birthday. This was about 10 years of being told I wasn't good enough for their version of family. That's when I decided to build my own family legacy. The next Monday morning, I walked into the county office and filed paperwork to start my own construction company. I'd been working for other contractors for years, learning the business from the ground up, saving money, and building relationships with suppliers and clients. I already had my contractor's license and enough savings to handle the startup costs. If they thought manual labor was beneath them, I'd show them what playing with tools could really build. I didn't need their approval to succeed, and I definitely didn't need their permission to prove them wrong about who I was and what I could accomplish. I stopped waiting for their approval. Once I stopped caring about their approval, things started moving fast. The construction business took off within the first year, mostly through word of mouth from satisfied customers who appreciated quality work at fair prices. I wasn't just doing basic residential repairs anymore. I was winning contracts for custom homes, commercial renovations, and eventually entire housing developments. By year 3, I was employing 12 full-time workers and had expanded into real estate development. I'd buy distressed properties, renovate them myself, and either flip them for profit or rent them out for steady income. The business was generating over $1 million in annual revenue, and my personal net worth was climbing faster than I'd ever imagined possible. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my family had spent years dismissing construction work as something for people who couldn't handle real careers, I was building an actual empire. Every foundation I poured, every roof I framed, every property I developed, was proof that their narrow definition of success was not only wrong, it was costing them the chance to know someone who was actually succeeding. While they judged my tools, I built an empire. Meanwhile, my family continued to operate under the assumption that I was still the same failure they'd always known. Whenever my name came up in family conversations, which wasn't often, the consensus was always that Derek was still doing manual labor and trying to make ends meet with his little handyman business. They never bothered to ask what I was actually doing. When distant relatives inquired about me at family gatherings, Mom would give vague answers about me being busy with work and quickly steer the conversation back to Jake's corporate achievements. As far as they knew, I was still the same blue-collar disappointment who wasn't worth including in family events. The lack of curiosity was telling. In 10 years, not one of them had asked to see any of my projects, inquired about my business plans, or shown even basic interest in what I was building. Their prejudice was so complete that they couldn't imagine I might actually be thriving in the career they'd dismissed. They never asked how I was really doing. But around the same time, my business was hitting its stride. Jake's corporate career was starting to show cracks. The first sign was when his company announced layoffs, and Jake went from confident golden boy to stressed-out employee who wasn't sure if his job was secure. The quarterly reports he used to deliver with such pride became sources of anxiety as his department faced budget cuts and restructuring. I heard through family gossip that Jake had started borrowing money from mom and dad to cover his mortgage payments when his salary got cut. The same parents who had helped fund his wedding and his house down payment were now providing emergency loans to keep their golden child afloat. The corporate success that had been the foundation of his family status was proving to be much less stable than anyone had expected. The stress was showing. During the few family photos that made it to social media, Jake looked tired and worried in ways he never had before. The confident business analyst who used to dominate family conversations was struggling to maintain the image that had defined his worth to everyone. Jake's golden career was starting to tarnish. Jake's corporate decline accelerated faster than anyone expected. Within 6 months of the initial layoffs, his entire company filed for bankruptcy. The firm that had once been the pride of his resume was suddenly worthless, and Jake found himself unemployed for the first time in his adult life, with no prospects and a skill set that seemed increasingly irrelevant in a competitive job market. The unemployment hit him hard, but the real crisis came when the mortgage payments started piling up. Jake had bought an expensive house based on his corporate salary, and without that income, he was facing foreclosure within months. The same golden boy who had once been celebrated for his financial success was now struggling to pay basic bills and watching his credit score plummet. The stress of losing everything he'd built his identity around was devastating. Jake went from confident business presentations to desperate job interviews, from networking events to unemployment office visits. The corporate world that had once embraced him seemed to have no place for a middle-aged analyst with experience at a failed company. The golden boy lost his shine. Around the same time Jake's career was imploding, Patricia's health took a serious turn. She needed emergency heart surgery, a complex procedure that would require multiple specialists and a long recovery period. The medical bills were staggering, easily reaching $200,000, even with insurance. Mom and Dad had been financially comfortable during their working years, but retirement had already stretched their savings thin, and they'd depleted even more of their resources, helping Jake with his mortgage problems. The combination of Patricia's medical emergency and Jake's ongoing financial crisis created a perfect storm that their middle-class savings couldn't weather. The family that had spent decades projecting an image of success and stability was suddenly facing bankruptcy. They needed serious money, and they needed it fast. Their traditional sources of help, family loans, credit extensions, selling valuable possessions, weren't going to be enough to cover the mounting bills. Suddenly, they needed someone with real money. That's when someone, probably Jake, desperately Googling anyone who might be able to help, stumbled across my LinkedIn profile. The construction business had grown large enough to warrant professional marketing, and my social media presence reflected the success I'd been building while they ignored me. The LinkedIn posts showed major construction projects with my company's name prominently displayed. Commercial Development's luxury home builds multi-million-dollar contracts with city planning departments. My Instagram account, which I mostly used for business networking, featured photos of the 3-story mansion I'd built for myself, complete with marble columns, a 5-car garage, and landscaping that had been featured in local home and garden magazines. There were pictures of me receiving business awards from the local Chamber of Commerce, shaking hands with city officials at project groundbreaking ceremonies, and cutting ribbons at the completion of major developments. The common laborer they'd dismissed was being recognized as a successful entrepreneur and community leader. The contrast between Jake's corporate collapse and my business success must have been shocking. While he was struggling to find any up that would pay his bills, I was being honored for contributing millions of dollars in economic development to the local area. While his house was facing foreclosure, I was living in a mansion that I'd designed and built myself. Social media showed them what they'd missed. The numbers told the real story of what I'd accomplished, while they were busy dismissing me. My primary business checking account held just over $5 million, not including the separate accounts for payroll equipment purchases and project management. The construction company was valued at $12 million, according to the most recent business assessment, with assets that included a fleet of specialized vehicles, a warehouse full of high-end equipment, and contracts extending 3 years into the future. But the business was just part of my wealth portfolio. The real estate investments had grown to include 23 properties across the region. Everything from rental apartments to commercial office buildings to luxury vacation homes that I'd built and sold to high-net-worth clients. The monthly rental income alone was enough to cover most people's annual salaries, and the property values had appreciated by over 40% in the past 5 years. My investment accounts held another $2 million in diversified stocks, bonds, and retirement funds. I'd learned early that construction income could be seasonal and unpredictable, so I'd made sure to build multiple streams of revenue that could support me, even if the business faced challenges. The financial advisors I worked with had helped me structure everything for long-term growth and tax efficiency. My bank account had more zeros than Jake ever saw. What made my wealth even more meaningful was how I'd chosen to use it. Unlike my family, who had always focused on accumulating status symbols and impressive appearances, I'd put significant money toward causes that actually mattered to real people facing real problems. The children's hospital in our city had an entire wing named after my construction company, funded by a $2 million donation that had covered new medical equipment and facility improvements. The wing specialized in cardiac surgery for kids, something that felt appropriate, given Patricia's current heart problems, though I doubted she'd appreciate the irony. I'd also established a scholarship fund for students from blue-collar families who wanted to pursue technical education or trade schools. The fund provided $50,000 annually to help kids who might not have family support for their educational goals, kids whose families might dismiss their career choices as playing with tools instead of recognizing the value of skilled trades. The homeless shelter downtown had been able to expand their capacity by 30 beds, thanks to funding I'd provided for building renovations and equipment purchases. I'd personally overseen the construction work, making sure the facility met the highest standards for safety and comfort. The people staying there deserved better than the bare minimum, and I'd made sure they got it. Local food banks, veterans organizations, and literacy programs had all received donations from me over the years. The total charitable giving from my personal accounts exceeded $800,000, money that had gone to help people who genuinely needed support and were working to improve their situations. I helped strangers more than my own blood, but I'd also been methodical about documenting my family's treatment over the years, partly for my own emotional processing, and partly because I'd suspected this day might eventually come. I had screenshots of family social media posts going back a decade, showing celebration after celebration where I was conspicuously absent. Birthday parties, holiday gatherings, anniversaries, graduations. There was a clear pattern of exclusion that couldn't be explained away as accidental oversight. The photos were particularly telling. family group shots that were carefully composed to include everyone except me, captions that talked about the whole family being together while I was deliberately excluded, posts that celebrated Jake's achievements while never acknowledging my existence, let alone my growing success. I had saved voicemails from Mom over the years, including the one from Patricia's 75th birthday party, where she'd explained that I wouldn't fit in with the other guests, and that my presence would make people uncomfortable. The recording captured her exact words about my lifestyle being too different from what the family wanted to project. I'd also kept documentation of the more subtle forms of exclusion, email chains about family planning, where my name was simply never included, text message screenshots where family members discussed events and activities with the clear understanding that I wasn't invited, witness statements from family friends who'd asked where I was at various gatherings and been told that I was going through a phase, or not really family-oriented. The evidence painted a clear picture of systematic rejection based on class prejudice and narrow definitions of success. They hadn't just excluded me from a few events. They'd spent 10 years erasing me from the family narrative because my career didn't match their idea of respectability. I had proof of every snub, every insult. Once the family discovered my success through social media, their reconnection attempts were both predictable and pathetic. After years of complete silence, I suddenly started receiving birthday cards in the mail. Cards that were clearly picked up at the last minute from a gas station, with generic messages about hoping we can catch up soon, and thinking of you on your special day. A cousin's wedding invitation arrived the first family event I'd been invited to in over a decade. The invitation was clearly last minute, sent just 6 weeks before the wedding date, and came with a handwritten note from Mom explaining that family is so important and that they'd love to have me there to celebrate. The phone calls started soon after. Dad called to talk about catching up and reconnecting as a family. Mom left voicemails about how much they missed me and how they'd been thinking about me constantly over the years. Jake even sent a few text messages about wanting to rebuild our relationship and put the past behind us. The timing wasn't coincidental. Every attempt at reconnection came after major signs of my financial success had appeared on social media. They weren't reaching out because they'd had some emotional breakthrough about family relationships. They were reaching out because they'd realized I was worth something to them now. Suddenly, they remembered I existed. I wasn't naive about what was coming. After 10 years of being dismissed and excluded, I knew this sudden interest in family reconciliation was driven by desperation rather than genuine love. I'd been preparing myself emotionally for this exact scenario, working with a therapist to process the years of rejection and develop healthy boundaries for dealing with toxic family dynamics. My business mentor had given me practical advice about protecting my wealth from family manipulation. He'd seen this pattern before with successful entrepreneurs whose families suddenly became interested in reconnection when money was involved. His guidance was simple. Document everything, set clear boundaries, and never make financial decisions based on guilt or family pressure. I'd also upgraded the security system at my house, not because I felt physically threatened, but because I wanted a complete record of any interactions that took place on my property. The doorbell camera, the security footage, and the recorded conversations would provide documentation of exactly what was said and how the family behaved when they thought I might be useful to them. I was ready to show them who they'd thrown away. The family's desperation reached a breaking point when Patricia's surgery was scheduled for the following month and Jake received his final foreclosure notice. With their backs against the wall and no other options for raising the money they needed, they decided to make their move. I learned later that they'd held a family meeting to plan their approach. The strategy was simple. show up at my house unannounced, present their financial crisis as a temporary emergency, and appeal to my sense of family loyalty, using phrases like, "blood is thicker than water," and "family helps family." They'd convinced themselves that I couldn't possibly refuse to help, once I saw how desperately they needed assistance. After all, I had more money than I could possibly spend, and they were family members facing genuine emergencies. In their minds, helping them was both the right thing to do and the inevitable outcome of their visit. They had nowhere else to turn. I let them into the house through the front entrance, watching their faces as they took in the marble foyer with its crystal chandelier and dual staircases. Mom's mouth actually fell open when she saw the scale of the entryway, and Dad kept looking around like he was trying to calculate the cost of everything he was seeing. This is your house?" Mom asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I led them through the main living areas, not bothering to hide my satisfaction at their shock. The home theater with its leather recliners and professional-grade sound system. The wine cellar that I'd built to hold over 1,000 bottles. The gourmet kitchen with commercial-grade appliances and a center island bigger than most people's dining rooms. The library with built-in mahogany shelving and a rolling ladder that I'd installed myself. When we passed through the garage, Jake stopped walking entirely. 5 cars were parked in pristine condition. The Mercedes they'd seen outside, a restored 1967 Mustang, a work truck that cost more than most people's houses, a vintage Porsche, and a Tesla that I used for local business meetings. "Jesus, Derek," Jake whispered. "How much is all this worth?" Patricia was silent throughout the tour, but I could see her mentally calculating the value of everything around her. The woman who had excluded me from her birthday party because I wouldn't fit in was now standing in a house that was worth more than everything her entire social circle owned combined. Every room showed them how wrong they'd been. When we finally sat down in my office, surrounded by framed business awards and photos of my construction projects, the facade of casual family reconnection finally cracked. Mom broke first, and the tears came along with the truth I'd been waiting 10 years to hear. "Derek, we need your help," she said, her voice shaking. "Patricia needs heart surgery, and it's going to cost $200,000 even with insurance. The doctors say she can't wait more than a few weeks, and we've exhausted every other option." Dad picked up where she left off, his voice heavy with the weight of financial reality. "Jake's house is in foreclosure. He owes more than it's worth, and he's been unemployed for 8 months. We've already given him everything we had in our retirement accounts, and it wasn't enough." Jake sat slumped in his chair, looking nothing like the confident golden boy who had once dominated every family conversation. "I lost everything," he said quietly. "The company went bankrupt, and my severance package was worthless stock options. I can't even find a job that pays enough to cover basic living expenses." Patricia finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "We know we haven't been good to you over the years. We made mistakes about what was important, about what success really looked like. We see that now." The admission hung in the air like an indictment. They'd spent 10 years treating me like an embarrassment, excluding me from their lives, because my blue-collar work didn't match their narrow definition of respectability. Now they were sitting in a mansion I'd built with my own hands, begging for money from the family failure they'd refused to acknowledge. Finally, they told the truth about needing me. I walked to my desk and pulled out a folder I'd prepared for this exact moment. Inside were printouts of my bank statements, showing the millions they'd never known about, photos of the charitable work they'd never bothered to ask about, and documentation of every exclusion and insult they'd inflicted over the past decade. "You're right," I said, setting the papers on the coffee table between us. "Family should help family. That's exactly what I've been doing for years." I showed them the photos of the children's hospital wing I'd funded, the scholarship program I'd established, the homeless shelter I'd expanded. I've given away more money to strangers than most people make in their lifetimes. I help people who need help and deserve help. Then I pulled out the screenshots of family photos where I'd been deliberately excluded. The documentation of events I'd been uninvited from, the recorded voicemails explaining why I didn't fit in with their social circle. But you made it very clear over the past 10 years that I'm not family. You excluded me from holidays, birthdays, weddings, and celebrations because my work embarrassed you. You called me a common laborer and said I was playing with tools instead of having a real career. I looked around at their shocked faces, taking in the full scope of their realization. You dismissed my success, ignored my achievements, and treated me like a failure who didn't deserve a place at your table. You spent a decade making sure I understood that I wasn't good enough for your family. I closed the folder and stood up. So now that you need something, you can't suddenly decide that family matters. You can't spend 10 years telling someone they're not family and then expect family loyalty when it's convenient for you. Family helps family, but you made sure I wasn't family. There was no dramatic argument, no pleading, no final attempts to change my mind. They simply sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing the reality of their situation. Mom wiped tears from her face without saying anything. Dad stared at the floor. Jake looked completely defeated. Patricia closed her eyes and said nothing at all. When they finally stood up to leave, they moved like people who had aged years in the span of a single conversation. I walked them to the door, and they filed out to their beat-up Honda Civic without looking back. The security cameras captured their entire departure, documenting the moment when they finally accepted that their golden boy favoritism had cost them everything. They left the same way they'd treated me, in silence. The months that followed brought a level of professional and personal satisfaction I'd never experienced before. My construction business won its largest contract ever, a $30 million mixed-use development that would employ over 100 people and revitalize an entire downtown district. The project earned recognition from the State Commerce Department and led to speaking engagements about successful entrepreneurship. I expanded my charitable giving, establishing partnerships with 3 additional organizations focused on helping people transition from poverty to self-sufficiency. The work felt more meaningful than any family relationship I'd ever had because it was based on genuine care for people who deserved support and were willing to work for better lives. The business awards and community recognition came regularly now. Local magazines featured my company in articles about economic development. The mayor appointed me to a committee advising on infrastructure improvements. I'd built something that mattered both financially and socially. I built more than a mansion. I built a legacy. The family never contacted me again, and I made sure they couldn't. I changed my phone numbers, upgraded my security systems, and instructed my business staff to screen all communications. They'd had their chance to be part of my life, and they'd chosen to exclude me for a decade based on their narrow prejudices. Now, I focused my energy on the people who had earned their place in my world. Business partners who respected my work, charitable organizations that appreciated my contributions, and friends who valued me for who I was rather than what I could give them. Some people earn their place at your table.